Folks, welcome inside the Parisi Palace, high above 3773 East Broadway. This is the Jake Feinberg Show, coming to you on Power Talk. Thank you so much for making us part of your day today, and what an honor it is to bring in a decorated engineer at a time when we had technology, but the technology was limited, so that a lot of times people did not obsess over, getting the bass drum sound. It wouldn't take 4 hours to get the bass drum sound. Generally speaking, you'd all hit in one room. There weren't a lot of baffles. And ultimately, the music that came out of the time that my guest really sang for his supper is still seminal music that remains true today because it feels good. And when I hear today, it doesn't matter what genre it is, across the board, the music has been synthesized and sterilized and layered so much that it just doesn't really feel good. So somebody could be playing a great saxophone solo or singing a great vocal, but it's been run through the machine so much and, quite frankly, has been meddled with so much by the technology, you're not really sure if that person actually even has serious musical chops. So much to talk about. Russ Gary, welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Thank you. Nice to speak with you.
Nice to speak with you. You know, we have a game on this program called Name That Voice, and I don't expect you to know who this is, but just pay attention to the content, and we'll come back and break it down.
Okay.
There were a group of us that mostly became the bands that were really found ourselves running into each other in some kind of magic cataclysm in the early 1960s in the Haight-Ashbury that had all come from various walks of life around the country, but had one sort of interest in common, and that was music, and in my case, music and sound, and how the two could go together. You got to remember that prior to that, there was no connection between live concert sound and the actual music. The sound systems were called public address systems. You could hear Elvis singing over some squawky speaker somewhere with no microphones anywhere on any of the instruments or anything.
Right.
So that was where it was when I started. And so it was me and the ones like me that sort of conceived, or for me, I'm not going to really only speak for myself, although I know a lot of my friends felt the same way, that I heard the music in my head along with everybody else. I came from a musician background, so I was really a musician before I was into sound and recording and stuff. But I noticed right away, one of the very first things I noticed was that I hearing the music and then hearing the way it actually came out in terms of audience concerts or even on records and stuff, there was like a huge disparity. And I've discovered that way from in front that I had the ability to translate the music that in our heads into the actual physical mechanics of the equipment. And in the day, it was pretty crude, but as the years went by, of course, that was part of the evolution of the music, was the evolution of the techniques and the equipment and stuff.
Russ Gary, you want to take a guess at who that is?
No, I don't know.
That is the brilliant engineer and musician Dan Healy. Did you know Healy?
Oh, yes, okay. I know Dan, or I knew him somewhat.
How did you... well, I wanted to ask you about what he was talking about, which is this idea... with the Grateful Dead, he was with the Grateful Dead, but you were with Credence and among other bands, and I wanted you to talk a little bit about, from your point of view, the music that the guys were hearing in their head, and then how you were able to bring that into life with, not just in the studio, but I mean, I know you did a live recording. Says here. Live in Europe. And I'm just wondering, if you could talk a little bit about kind of what he was talking about, how you translated the sound that was in your head into something that was meaningful to a large stadium venue.
Well, it came from actually making the studio recordings, because the way I used to do it is when a band came in to Wally Heider's in San Francisco, where I was recording at that time, I would just go out into the studio after all of the technical equipment was set up and listen to the band play for a while. And then I would go in and try and recreate what I was hearing them play. And some of the best music, actually, that I recorded contained almost no EQ. So if the source on the floor, recording floor, was good, the microphones would capture it, and usually there wasn't a lot to do until the actual mix-down time came, and then some effects were added and possibly a little EQ here and there, and but for the most part, the sound of the instruments spoke for themselves, really.
Can you give an example when you first got to Wally Heider's about a specific situation? I mean, some bands were improvisatory in nature. Others were more singer-songwriter. But can you talk about a time when your methodology wasn't necessarily road-tested, but you did it and it really turned out great, and then you realized that it was the perfect, way to go?
I will tell you how I sort of developed that approach to recording. I arrived in Long Beach, California, in late 1962. I was a musician, had been playing on the East Coast for many years with my band, and then I was in another band in Long Beach, and we played up and down the South Bay for many years. And then I started recording songs by our band. The name of it was Lloyd, Terry, and the Victors.
Wow.
And the band consisted of myself, Lloyd Terry, and his brother Bob on the drums, and Brian and Doug Decker, two boys whose father was Jim Decker, one of the greatest French horn players of all time. And I met them, and we formed our band, and Terry was the focal point, good songwriter, and a lot of people liked him and had interest in him. But as I said, I started recording my band in my garage just to try and capture our songs, original tunes, and even tunes that we thought we'd like to try. And we recorded those tunes to see what they sounded like. And then my recording started basically right there. At that time, I started off with a little Sony recorder and a few cheapy mics, and then as time passed, I bought more nice equipment. I bought some nice bikes. I bought a very nice concert tone recorder, 2-track, which was a Japanese clone of the famous Ampex recorder that was in use, and everything just sort of grew from there. But to get back to learning about the technique I developed, is I did not have any equalization in either one of my studios, and the most outboard equipment I had was a home-built limiter that I found in Popular Electronics magazine, and I just ran everything through that little thing, and it changed my recordings to where people commented at the time. The phrase was, "Oh, that sounds electric," and so that's where it all started. But I would place the microphones in specific spots to where it began to sound like what I was hearing on the floor when I would go out and play guitar and this, that, and the other. And so that's how that started. And when I eventually evolved into professional recording, that was the approach I took, and it truly worked well, because most of the artists and musicians I recorded really knew how to get the source of their instruments right, and really what was needed was just place a good mic in front of the equipment.
What do you mean the source of their instrument?
The source that the players created. In other words, the settings on their amplifiers, the drums were tuned to a nice place. Most people, unless they were, most people that recorded had been doing it quite some time and knew how to tune their instruments and amplifiers and that type of thing. And so it really, if you didn't become a knob twirler and just brought the sound up on the speakers and you had the mics in the right spot, you could get a very nice sound without equalizing it too much. For example, on Credence Clearwater records, the only EQ I used, for the most part, once in a while, but was on the ride cymbal of Doug Clifford's drum kit. I added 1 click, maybe 3 dB of 10K, 10,000 cycles, to the U87 mic that was positioned above his ride cymbal. And then the rest of the time, it was just mic placement, and I always placed a U87 microphone about, I'm going to say 5 or 6 feet behind the drum kit against the wall. And in those days, everything was close mic'd, if you know what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. And that was the trend of the day. And that U87 provided some nice room ambiance to the overall sound of everybody.
Let me ask you, this is so beautiful. I mean, people are I am not an engineer aficionado, but the idea of room ambiance in today's world is like an anathema in some ways. And I just wanted you to talk about your concept of, some of my favorite records have a lot of leakage and a lot of air and a lot of space and a lot of room ambience. And I get that everything is mic'd today. Every single drum is mic'd. There's no space. And I just wanted you to talk about, your concept of leakage and how that maybe lent itself to, some of these iconic hits that you were a part of. To me, it's a disappearing act at this point.
Well, I suppose that's true, but everything evolves, and engineers, musicians, producers are constantly squeezing the lemon, if you will. And but I agree with you. And when I first started, I had no baffles. I had none of this, and I didn't use very much of that when I finally ended up at Wally Heider's. And natural leakage was part of the entire sound scope. And
Can you explain? Can you explain why it was part of the natural soundscape?
You mean, well, if you didn't, usually baffles were used to protect the microphone, not the equipment, really. And at Wally Heider's, we had these very small little baffles that were used that were made of plywood with some kind of material, and you just kind of tucked it behind the microphone in front of the amplifier or whatever. And it didn't deaden down the sound coming from the amplifier or instrument too much, or drums. There was some drum baffles placed around them, but they were minimal, and it didn't impede the sound of the instruments as much as some folks do it today. Sometime today they'll place an entire drum kit in a room and close the door.
Right, right.
And so as a result, the microphones would hear neighboring instruments, and that was the leakage I think you might be talking
You just
about.
articulated it perfectly. I mean, did you Wally Heider's there were a lot of jazzers coming through there. Did you have an opportunity?
A lot of what?
A lot of jazz musicians,
Yes.
And I'm just curious, like the site that I'm looking at that gives you credits, it's the Credence Clearwaters, the Blue Cheers, and the Crosby, Stills and Nashes. But I know like Vince Guaraldi used to hang out there. A lot of Charlie Brown used to go down there. Can you talk about some of the jazz sessions that you engineered?
Most of my work was popular music, rock and roll, if you will. But I did record several jazz artists. One of my favorite being Cal Tjader, the great.
All right, dude, I'm so happy. When I started my show, Russ, like 10 years ago, Cal's spirit, he was one of the earliest. I mean, I never knew him. He was long since left this planet, but I went after all of his accompanists, and his daughter wound up connecting me with Dave Brubeck for an interview. And please talk about Cal Tjader. That man was a total genius. What album did you record with him at Wally Heider's?
It was. Let me just preface by saying this. When making recordings by Credence, I became somewhat of a good friend of Fantasy Records, their label.
Yeah, sure.
And
Saul Zantz.
They were across the bay in Berkeley, in their small place at the time. And then they began sending, they had a little small studio over there, and they began sending some of those 8-track projects over for me to mix for them, for their artists. And then that's how that relationship grew. Not only was it Credence, but there was a very fine producer, well-rounded jazz, great arranger, good musician, named Ed Bogus.
Dude, I've interviewed him twice, man. He's a total genius.
He is unbelievable.
Unreal dude, man. You're warming my heart right now.
Well, anyway, Ed would bring things over for me to mix for him. And this particular time, he was producing an album called Tjader. That's all the name on the album was, and it was a big a very large photo of Cal's face right on the jacket.
I know the
And,
album, so I know it well. I actually know. Oh my God, dude! This is one of my favorite freaking albums because, well, it says engineer Russ Gary, but it's because it's my favorite people are on it, including the late great Dick Burke and Al Zuleika. Unbelievable, man.
I think was Pete Escovedo or
100% correct. No, and
Yeah.
they did. There's so tell me about that experience, especially because, I mean, you were pop rock music. That's one kind of thing. This album, which I actually know very well, what's the one tune I love? I Showed Them. Evil. God, there's some really funky stuff.
Evil Ways.
Evil Ways is on there.
Supremes songs. That's what I truly enjoyed it because it wasn't Cal's typical foray into pure jazz and
right. It wasn't bebop.
you know,
Yeah,
long,
no, it wasn't. Yeah, totally.
long songs. It was a kind of a pop version
Mm-hmm.
of Cal, and I think he did a Donovan song.
You're
on that
you're
record.
spot on, dude. I
And-
know he did. He did Donovan, Michael LeGrand, Holland Dozier, Lennon McCartney.
Yes,
There's actually only
And-
there's 2 originals.
That's right, and that studio at Wally Heider's was the second one that had recently opened, and it was that studio was so quiet, it was so damped down. That entire band was just all grouped in a big, tight circle, and there's some leakage in there. And but you know, jazz musicians, the fewer mics you use, the happier they are. And but I did.
Explain that. Just explain to a naive 43. Why did jazz musicians like less mics?
Because they truly liked the leakage.
Oh, so
factor.
that's why I love leakage, because I'm a jazzer at heart. Yeah.
Yeah, and and I did not have a lot of baffles, and the same approach recording that band. Although I did mic up Dick Burke's drums with more than 1 or 2 mics, I believe. I have a memory of that session, or those sessions. Dick had a what they call a Chinese cymbal that when he hit it, it permeated everything in sight.
Was it? It was a gong kind of thing.
It wasn't quite a gong,
Yeah.
but it was. They had I'm afraid I've forgotten the official name of it.
Sure, but it had a resonance to it.
It had a splash sound that just went everywhere. And I mean, I had all these mics out. You know, Cal was playing the
Vibraphone.
vibraphone, and his mics were wide open, and it was just it basically all just sort of worked. You had to fudge it a little bit here and there, you know, with levels, but it's one of my favorites. And
Dude, I'm telling you right now, I've had that album in possession several times. I will never, once I find it again, I will never give it up, because Russ Gary engineered that session. It was always so, but that wasn't a situation. I mean, Bogus would bring you tapes to mix, but this was all the cats were at Wally Heider's for this one.
I missed that last.
I mean,
statement.
you know what I'm trying to say is, like, Bogus would sometimes bring you stuff from Fantasy to mix tapes, but in this case, the actual session was recorded at Wally Heider's.
Right. That's at that particular point. Fantasy started sending their artists and a full complement over, and we would record there. at that point, Fantasy was building its own new complex over at 10th and Parker in
Absolutely.
Berkeley.
Jim Stern was building those.
Yeah. Jim
yeah.
and Brent, his cohort was.
I don't know Brent.
They called him BR, Brent Reynolds, I believe.
Brent Reynolds.
And but Jim was fine. He was cool. I liked him a lot.
Man.
And he may have even engineered some of those things that were sent over previously from Fantasy's little studio. I think they had a little 8-track studio, and I don't know what the console they used, but at times the little front end trim system would get hit a little hard, but it seemed to work just fine. There were several projects that came over like that. Not only Cal, Bogus brought the Brothers 4 over, if you can believe that.
And you know, it's funny because it's just so interesting because it's all on the Fantasy label, but you then you look down, you say recorded at Wally Heider Studios. So how did that Four Brothers session work? Because that is way out of the box.
I loved it. My musical palette is huge. Basically I'm a countrified rock and roller, but I love everything.
Dig, man. Yeah, man.
And I love good jazz. I love Frank Sinatra. I love Ahmad Jamal. I love them all. And but the Brothers 4 had one shot with Fantasy, and that was actually Fantasy's way at the time. Not everyone could be Credence Clearwater. You know, they were the luxury liner of Fantasy.
Absolutely,
if you will.
they were.
And but I truly enjoyed the Brothers 4. They had extremely successful records with Columbia before Fantasy, and the Fantasy record I made with sort of had the miking and that I had done before on some of the rock and roll groups, you know.
Sure.
So it was a little different for Brothers 4, but it was, as far as I'm concerned, it was good, and I truly enjoyed it. In fact, those sessions with Bogus were some of my favorite memories.
The man, I mean, if he needed, he could write out a chart for horns, four-part horns. I mean, the guy was like a total avatar, and he could play fiddle because he played with Country Joe and the Fish for a minute. The guy was unbelievable. I'm just curious about, like with Cal, you know, you had Pete Escovedo maybe playing congas or timbales, and then Michael Smith was playing congas. Like, did you do any overdubbing, or was it literally everybody in a circle just knocking it out?
I cannot remember a single overdub during those sessions.
So the horns were there too?
Yeah, if you're listening closely to Evil Ways,
yes,
you'll hear me moving the fader on the B3 organ. And we just didn't go back and make it perfect. It's still there. It was live in Studio D.
Did you ever work with the legendary drummer Steve Mitchell?
Can't say that I did.
Okay. You know, Russ, I wanted to play you another audio clip. It's another Name That Voice. Again, just pay attention to the content, and then we'll come back.
Okay.
I think the cookie cutter syndrome comes from, if you listen to all these pop hits right now, they're probably written, produced by probably the same 10 people, you know, Bruno Mars versus, you know, Dr. Luke versus whoever. And they all kind of use the same samples, they all kind of use the same programs, and so that's where the similarity and the cookie cutterness comes from. When you listen to records that were made years ago, and I'll give you an example, I was doing a Motels record, and I cut a song with her called Only the Lonely, and she did this great yodel at the end of the song on take number 6. Well, and take number 2 was the take I used, so it took me 2 days to fly that lick in, trying to line up 2 tape machines and get them to lock up so that you could fly that in. That would be a cut and paste in 3 seconds. So that's where the thing has gotten a lot easier. In terms of the artistic angle and credibility as a singer, like I said, there's singers that you can't discount their vocal ability, and then I'm sure there's singers that are, kind of marginal that they can pump up. The problem is that there is zero, and I say zero, dynamic range in any records made today. Everything has to be loud.
You nailed it.
Yeah.
No Where did? All right, Russ. That was an interview I did with Val Garay, a great engineer.
Yes.
And I just want you to talk about in pop music there is no dynamic range today in pop music, and I understand we evolve, technology evolves, but I've interviewed Bernard Purdy, all the hits he was on. He said, do not wear in-ear mics. Drummers should not wear in-ear mics because all of a sudden they're listening to themselves, then they're behind the beat, and you don't play with dynamics. As an engineer, especially with some of those Credence hits, how did you go about creating dynamics in the studio, especially because you were not somebody, minimal mic placement, small baffles. Was it more about the idea? Well, I'll let you take the floor. How did you create dynamics with all those amazing hits?
Frankly, I did not create the dynamics. The musicians did.
Explain that. Why were they cognizant of that because of the crappy PA systems that they had to play out of? Why were they so hip to dynamics, and why has that gone by the wayside? And a lot of kids, you can't even detect that. They don't even. It's just this quantized sort of up and down thing. There's no bounce to it. There's no roundness to it.
Well, I am truly not a technical whiz. I'm just a guy that.
I'm looking for your opinion. I know you don't. There's no right or wrong answer.
Well, what I'm saying, what I believe the answer to your question is when, especially when CD became the way to listen to music.
The listening medium, the primary listening medium. Yeah.
Yes, and it suffered greatly. It had wonderful clarity and frequency range, but when the digital toys, like I said before, everyone's been trying to squeeze the lemon out of all of this, and when those toys came along, they just jam-packed them in there and just let the built-in compression of these digital devices just keep it as loud as they could, to try and make something sound louder than this guy over here or this guy over there. Now, that's interesting to me because when analog records were being made, they still tried to keep it loud like that. But we used things like Fairchild limiters on the mastering. And if you want to hear what a record really should have sounded like back in the day, you'll probably find a Fairchild limiter slapped on the output of the mix that goes to the cutting head of the vinyl master. So it's not an unusual practice to want to have loudness on your recording, hopefully to impress a DJ or someone who's going to play it possibly. But it just went too far with the compression and the constant evolvement of technical equipment to, hey, this is going to make it sound great, but what it did not do, it just squashed everything into a non-dynamic piece of work. And I think that is a major part of why the feel has disappeared on a lot of recordings.
How did you get connected? Did you know Wally Heider in Southern California at all? How did you get connected to the studio?
When I'm going to say 64, 65 or so, Lloyd, Terry, and the Victors was playing up a storm. Up and down the coast, we had great gigs. We'd play for 300, 400, 500 people on the weekends.
Wow.
At a place called the Never on Friday Club.
Which city was that in?
Well, I lived in Long Beach, right on the beach.
Mm-hmm.
And but this outfit would rent hotel space. Every Friday night, we'd play in a massive place. Sometimes down at Newport Beach, in a big hotel. We played the Disneyland Hotel many times. We played the hotels at LAX many times. But we were everything else was happening up on the Strip. The Birds and all of that genre, the Laurel Canyon groups.
Absolutely, totally, yeah.
But here we were down in the South Bay playing all these places and having a good time. But our band, we had just a really good band. And so that's how I learned really what things sounded like. You can't play for 10 years and not know what a drum sound sounds like. And so then when you go into the studio, that's your goal because you want to make it sound like a drum sound. And as a result, I truly never spent much time at all getting a drum sound. Most of the time, tweaking the drums was the snare drum and sometimes the kicker, but that was the drummer doing that. You'd lay a wallet or a piece of cloth, or in my case, I used Sony microphone bags, little cloth bags, and taped them on the edge just to quiet the pop down on the snare, or if it sounded like we called it, they sounded like garbage cans lids, but not too often. But that's how we came about. To get back to your question.
Yeah. Now I'm looking for your inroads. I know you already had that understanding of sound because of your acumen with the band. But who was your connection into the studios?
Okay. I told you about James Decker, the great French horn player. Wally Heider himself was an engineer for the great Bill Putnam. Do you know that name?
It was down in California. Yeah.
He started Universal Audio in Chicago and made great hits. He was a great engineer, and he was also a great technical man. And he built equipment like the LA2A limiters, the everything you see today that is equipment that I'll think of the name of it in a moment. But Wally used to record all of these big bands and orchestras, and and many times Jim Decker was part of the orchestra, and they got to be friends. And the orchestras and big bands, and Wally was a big band fan. Anyway, that's where Wally came to prominence. He built his recording, a little recording system that he'd haul around to these big band gigs and record the bands. And then he kept copies for himself and all of that. But he was very popular with all of these musicians, including Jim Decker. So Jim, being Brian and Doug's father, arranged a session for Lloyd Terry and the Victors at Wally Heider's new little place on Selma Avenue, right next to Cahuenga Boulevard in Hollywood. And
was that Shelley's, above Shelley's manhole?
Yes, it was the
I
same
love it.
building.
Beautiful. Yeah.
And well, Wally's place wasn't on the corner like Shelley's manhole, but you had to walk a few steps down into the alley, and you could get into his little office and the studio. And that's where I first met Wally Heider, although it was he didn't know me from Adam, and he didn't remember me from Adam. But that was my first connection with Wally, and he did a great job recording our band in his tiny little studio. We were all just crammed in and doing it just like you and I previously discussed. And after the session, I was jazzed up. You know, I had to go buy more stuff and get my garage going, you know. And so that's where I met Wally. And then after recording in my garage for a while longer, I heard that a studio was opening up in Santa Ana, California. Wow. And I went out there, and the place was not even complete yet. They were doing sessions, and the panel was not even hooked onto the board yet. And you could look right down and see all the wires, but they were doing sessions with the panel off the top of a console. And the guy that owned that console was George J. Fernandez, the whole studio, George Fernandez, and he was one of the Wrecking Crew engineers, and at Gold Star Recording, and I'm sure you know about that. And so he hired me because he was losing his guy, and that's where I did my first sessions. I did several country singles and an album by a group, and I wasn't getting paid, but that was okay.
Wait, hold on. What was the? I mean, you were interning, or and what was the group's name? What was the group's name?
It was like, "Here, you're it," and so and I did it, and long story short, on that studio, I took those recordings to Wally Heider, and he hired me in Los Angeles.
What was the name of the group, or the album you did?
It was called Research 1612.
My God. I mean, on what label was it? You have any idea?
It was a label called Flick City in Hollywood.
Oh, my God. And so then
it was just a great studio in the Bill Putnam tradition, United Western Recording tradition.
Wow.
And I liked it. But, you know, at that particular time, that studio being in Santa Ana was a little bit too far for artists to go from Hollywood when so many great ones were all packed within a small area within Hollywood. And so George was having a tough go of it. And then when Wally hired me in, I believe it was March of 1968, he had just finished recording the Monterey Festival. I don't know if they called it a blues festival.
It was a Monterey Pop.
Yes, Monterey Pop. And he was jazzed up to build his San Francisco facilities. He'd already gotten the property together, and one of the guys on staff was slated to go to San Francisco and be Wally's heavy, as they were called in those days. And he changed his mind, and I said, I'll go. And that's how I ended up there. And my first duties for that studio was many airplane trips up and back to help the chief engineer just do whatever I could do. I did a lot of soldering on microphone jacks in the walls and just anything I could do. And that's how the San Francisco operation started, and that's how basically I started. And once again, when I got to San Francisco, I'm telling you, that place was just jumping.
I mean, you could not have possibly gone at a better time in music history.
Well, that's correct, and a lot of it in that business is timing.
Yeah.
And so I had just made the Green River album with CCR. Mm-hmm. And right after that, Stephen Stills, Graham Nash, and Crosby showed up. We gave them a little tour of the studio, and Wally, a day or so later, said, "Look, they want to try some stuff with you." I said, "Okay." Their normal recording engineer was the great one, Bill Halverson, who was actually Wally Heider studio manager in Los Angeles, where we all were at the time. But I don't know the reason why he wasn't available, and Wally said, well, they'd like to try it with you until Bill is available. I said, great. So I spent a week with them, and during that week I recorded Woodstock, Teach Your Children, Our House, and Helpless by, that was Neil Young's song, and he showed up a little later in the week. And
you're blowing my, I cannot, that was on the Deja Vu album.
The Deja Vu album, yes. And
wow.
So that was all great. I just had the greatest time, and I loved every minute of it.
Well, I mean, those, can you just talk about like working with guys? I think part of the magic of an engineer is, a lot of musicians, they'll go up and you have to play a pedal steel solo, and they always say, let me do another take. I can do it better. And you're like, the engineer's sort of like, nope, that's it. You're done. We're good. And you have to kind of, I mean, they're artists. They get carried away. They are not engineers. And how did you deal with the personalities of Crosby and Stills specifically? Because you recorded, I mean, that album is a seminal folk rock album of all time.
Yes.
I mean, what I'm saying is beyond just hitting the record button and placing the mics, can you talk about how you shaped those tunes in your own way? I mean, sometimes, there's a reason why they're musicians and not engineers. I think that's part of the issue today also, is that you have people that really believe that they have the ability to do everything well, even though they're really gifted in one area. And as a result, they do not know how to delineate responsibility. I'm just trying to figure out if you could talk, it doesn't have to be with that particular session, but just a time when you recognized that you needed to offer your own, because your ears were huge, that you had to sort of intervene and let people know that what they were doing was fine and they didn't need to keep going.
Well, as far as creative parts were concerned by an artist or a band member or whatever, and if my role was exclusively as an engineer, I said nothing. The producer was in charge of taking care of that. Now, I have produced a lot of music, and then I felt just quite comfortable saying, nope, we got it, just like you said. And most of the time, that would be the end of it. Once in a while, you'd get someone who said, well, I think I can really do it better. And if you believe him, because you're aware of his musicianship and you trust him to do it, then you just go for it. Today, you can do it with your Pro Tools rig because you have unlimited tracks, and you can save the one that you thought the performance that you thought was good, and then you'd have the new one, and then you could say, see how the original one is so much better. And they usually were. They were full of inspiration, and that's kind of where I came from as a recording engineer. Is you go in at 1 o'clock, set the session, record it, mix it a little later, and that evening the producer walked out with his master recording.
Well,
that's where the inspiration for all of those great hits of that time were. And every day that you labor on something, everybody gets a little less sharp with it, myself included. And
right.
But one of my favorite producers I worked with was Eric Jacobson. He produced The Lovin' Spoonful. That was his big. He was a banjo player, but wanted to be a producer, and so he produced The Lovin' Spoonful probably back east somewhere. But he located to San Francisco, and one of his artists was Norman Greenbaum, and
wow.
He, like many others, had recorded a group of tracks over at Coast Recorders, which was one of Bill Putnam's places.
Totally.
And he brought over some very fine sounding tracks to Wally Heider's after we opened, and I mixed Norman's album for him, and one of those songs was Spirit in the Sky. And
wow. Amazing.
That record has an amazing trail of success with it, and it's been not only was it a couple of million sellers for Norman, but it has been reused about 400 or more times now in films and just other things, TV shows. What a wonderful life that song had. And, of course, something that huge is awfully hard to follow up with but Norman was kind of like a jug band guy and came out of that scene. And I just love Norman because he had the greatest wit. Silent wit, I called it.
Yeah, dude, rest in peace, man. Jeez, I mean,
without making a comment, and you'd get a chuckle out of it.
Were you in a doo-wop group or a jug band back east? What kind of music were you playing back there?
I was in. My first music was old country music, and I was a very young guy. It would be people like T. Texas Tyler, the Sons of the Pioneers, and then Les Paul, of course. Mm-hmm. That was the one that knocked me out of the park. And not only was it all that great guitar work he did, it was the sound. That could be the one that really kicked me into gear into appreciating great sound. And my brother-in-law, who was a great player, he married my sister, and they went and moved to California, and that was another reason I relocated to Southern California. But he was a great player, and he had an old Zenith 78 player where you would open the door and shove the record in and close the door, and the record would play. You'd never see anything. And that's where I first heard Whispering by Les Paul. And I got to tell you, after there was nothing else I wanted to do.
The Green River album, I mean, studio time was not nearly as exorbitant as it is today, but I mean, how quickly what was the magic behind that album? Why did Stills and Nash and Crosby want to work with you?
I think they liked Green River a lot, and the thing about Credence was they were extremely well rehearsed when they showed up, and frankly, John Fogerty was a bit of an intense guy, but they came in and did it. If you want to hear a bit of a story,
go please. Go ahead.
One day I entered Wally Heider's in the front door, and there was John Fogerty just standing there. And the place, Studio C, the magic room up there, we had just really begun doing sessions and hadn't even received all of the good equipment yet. But he was standing there, and Wally took him around, and so a few days later, he called and booked a demo session. He wanted to try the studio, and he wanted to try me, and see how it went. So the band came over, and we recorded 2 instrumentals. I don't know if you know this story.
Oh my God, this is insane! Just instrumentals.
Just 2 instrumentals, and one of them was called Briar Patch, and the other was called Glory Be.
Wow.
And those tracks have surfaced, but they were never released until after the Credence career was over, I don't believe. And but everybody passed the audition, and then a little bit later, we did the Green River single session for the single record. And then a little bit later, we reconvened and did the remainder of the songs for the album.
That is an absolute... So, Fogerty, did he ever tell you how he got wind of you? How he discovered... It was like, wow, I want to...
Well, they had been recording their music down at RCA in Hollywood.
Wow.
With that group down there. And when Wally Heider opened, Heider's reputation is what drew the talent, because he was such a heavyweight in Los Angeles, and
Absolutely.
He was so successful. So a lot of people would, especially the San Francisco groups, they would, I believe, rather stay at home and record rather than travel to New York or Los Angeles or other places. Now the big movement to go, say, like in Colorado and record hadn't quite started yet, and so people had a tendency to, if they liked what they had, they would record nearby their living area.
What? I'm sorry, I'm not hip to this Colorado tape recording renaissance. What are you referring to?
Well, for a while, well-known studios began popping up all over the place.
Wow.
And a lot of people were having big budgets from their labels, and they'd travel out to, say, Colorado and record in the woods and make an album there. I believe George Martin had a place in the Bahamas, and people would go and record in the Bahamas. Like I say, the budgets were huge, and they just spent the money to do that and probably enjoy the delights of the local hemp or whatever, and feel private because
right. It was much more rural and private, and you had privacy there.
Plus, those folks had a tendency to build just great facilities, and that became the norm. Even Crosby, Stills and Nash took off and went to London for a while. The Eagles did that,
Right.
and so.
Let me ask you a question. I mean, the cat I wanted to ask you about, because I have to. I run into his albums once in a while, and the rhythm sections to me are really special because some of the most beautiful cats were on them as these Tom Fogerty sessions, because it was Bill Vitt and John Kahn did a lot of the rhythm section work for Tom. And
I've recorded those two many times.
Can you talk about? I mean, because could talk about Kahn and Vitt, man. I mean, to me, like Bill Vitt, you talk about Cal Tjader being a spiritual compass at the beginning. I did a couple of interviews with Bill. I did many interviews with Bill Vitt, and the guy, whatever, him and Kahn, they did all that Brewer and Shipley stuff, and they were doing the stuff with. Can you talk about any memories from those sessions? Because you did all of Fogerty's solo albums.
I also produced and played music on Tom Fogerty's recordings.
But you played you played guitar, or what did you play?
Yeah, I played guitar.
Oh my God!
I played with Doug and Stu from Credence, the bass and drums, and I'll give you that story in just a moment.
Yeah.
But Bill Vitt and John Kahn played not only on the well-known pieces that you just mentioned. They were on lots of recordings that came into Wally Heider's by artists that were not very well known at all. But Bill Vitt and John Kahn were just a rock solid team. One of my favorite albums I made with those two was Hooter Roll.
Wait a minute! Whoa! Wait! You. Curly Cook,
one
Garcia.
of the greatest rhythm players of all time, Curly.
Wait a minute. Howard, my dear friend, rest in peace, Howard Wales, Garcia. You were engineering Hooterol?
Yes, I did.
Please tell me about that. That's so freaking classic.
That was done in the same studio as Cal Tjader's album.
Wow.
Martin Fierro.
Absolutely, man. Are you kidding me, dude?
And the men you just mentioned, that was Alan Douglas came in from New York, and
wow.
And I booked that studio, and that was another. That was, as I mentioned, that room was super quiet, and there was hardly any baffling done, and I worked with Garcia many times like that on other sessions, but I never did any of the Grateful Dead work. That was other engineers.
Sure, no, let's go back to this Hooterol. Was Kahn on bass, or was it Jelly Roll Troy?
It was John Kahn.
How? I mean,
and Bill Vitt on drums.
That was like Garcia and Wales's interpretation of Bitches Brew Acid Jazz. I mean, that was a louder session than a Cal Tjader session. Can you talk about how those guys? Well, I mean, just in general, how that whole session worked. That's another one of those albums that, like, over time, like a fine wine, it's just accrued a lot of value. It just continues, mainly because Jerry's kind of just playing the guitar like he doesn't know how to play the guitar, similar to McLaughlin In a Silent Way. I'm not comparing their styles, but
I was pleasantly surprised to hear Jerry jump on those songs like that.
Sure.
With that different approach than he did with the Grateful Dead. And I do not think there was any previous rehearsal going on. Everyone just gathered and did it. And I could be wrong about that, but that's what I believe happened. And
it was all and very minimal. But with Kahn and Vitt, they always very little. I mean, was one hit, one take, and moving on. There was not multiple takes.
There might have been a couple of multiple takes, but those songs were pretty typical of the day, wherein they were extended
Jams, yeah.
jams. But for them to show up and not take much time at all to nail the performances was quite impressive. And Howard Wales came from a group I recorded.
A.B. Sky, man. Dude, tell me about A.B. Sky, man, please.
A.B. Sky. Yes, that band came from Wisconsin.
That's right.
And settled in the Bay Area. And they were a very good band. And Curly Cook also came from that band. You mentioned Curly.
And Ben Sidran as well. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, Ben Sidran. And Ben Sidran was quite a popular guy in the Bay Area at the time.
Yeah, he was writing all those Steve Miller hits. Yeah.
And then, let's see, I lost my train of thought. But that album, the guy misspelled my name on it.
You mean the A.B. Sky?
Yeah. No. Oh, I'm sorry. A.B. Sky. Yes. They had A.B. Sky had already been well known and decided to come to exist in the Bay Area and do some work. And I did quite a few little projects with some of their band members. But the A.B. Sky album I did was produced.
Kim Fowley.
Kim Fowley, the great Kim Fowley. And not only did I enjoy making that album, I really enjoyed listening to Kim and his stories, because he's first generation rock and roll like I am. And so not only was it a fun record to record musically, it was good listening to Kim and his stories sometimes.
How was it working for you, as an engineer? You were obviously on salary. You would work sessions. Do engineers or producers see royalties for any of the content that might take off and become wildly successful musically?
Are you asking if engineers made extra money?
I'm just wondering. Yeah, I'm wondering if you ever get royalty checks for any of the hits that you engineered or produced.
I do not.
Wow.
I was a salaried employee for Wally Heider, and
which in itself is so ridiculously classic. I mean, I just think that. That was enough for you to basically. You became the engineer. You got on a serious roll in the mid to late 60s, and then the door. Can you just talk about the trajectory of your career after you had solidified yourself as an A1 engineer?
Well, I used to bug Wally Heider for more money all the time, because in the music business, nothing is forever, and sooner or later it's all going to disappear. And then Wally would frown and give me a $10 raise, and then by the time I had begun doing albums like Hooterole, Wally gave me a little cut of the studio. And
I'm sorry, what does that mean? What does that mean?
He gave me a little piece of the gross net profit of the place, the entire studio.
Oh, wow. That's kind of, so you sort of get a residuals.
But
yeah.
Most engineers just simply did not get it. They just, that's just the way it was in those days, and you worked for the studio. Wally did tell me one day, he says, "Go out and bring me some clients, and I'll give you another $10 an hour." Well, I mean, I got so I was in that Wally Heider studio for just long enough to go home and take a nap, and how am I going to bring anybody in, so during that time, I'll give you one more story.
Do it.
During that period after Hooterroll, I was going from one studio to another to pick up a little bit of splicing tape.
Sure.
And I walked in the studio deep, and I was hearing this lovely jazz music, and it wasn't very loud at all, and I looked over, and there sat Duke Ellington.
Steve Mitchell. Steve Mitchell was an amazing drummer in the Bay Area, played with Terry Haggerty and John Allaire, played with, did a lot of studio work for Ed Bogus, and he told me so you didn't know him personally, but when he walked into Wally Heider's in 1972, and he heard this piano, and it was Duke Ellington.
He knew it. Well, one of my favorite Duke records of all time is the 1956 Newport Jazz Festival, and I suppose a lot of post work from the performance was done, overdubs later, but even so, that's my favorite, one of my favorites of all time. But then, right after that, Saul Zantz, and I know you know that name.
Yeah, I sure do.
Called and asked if I would come and work at Fantasy's new place, and his words to me were, "You can do anything you want." And I said, "Oh." And so I did, because being a musician and a creative person, I got to produce my own music over there, and I still, of course, recorded Credence and John Fogerty stuff, and then shortly after I was at Fantasy, working with some fine artists, Doug Clifford made a solo album down at the Factory, and which I was the co-producer on, and I hired one of Wally Heider's trucks to come in, and we recorded it with just some of the greatest musicians, Tower of Power section, horn section, Duck Dunn, who was one of my great friends, John McPhee,
Sure,
who went on to be the guitarist in the Doobies, but that was Credence's rehearsal space, and they would go in there every single day and play and rehearse. That's why they were so good. But that studio ended up being the genesis of a new company formed by Doug Clifford, Stu Cook, and myself, and it was called DSR. And I had a very top-notch remote truck built, and not only did we record and produce music at the Factory, we went out and I recorded umpteen performances by people just... Do you recall anyone ever talking about the King Biscuit flour?
Yeah, I've seen. I definitely. Sure, absolutely.
Well, another fellow from L.A. decided to do the same kind of thing, and he hired our truck. And I must have recorded 10 or 12 people from Boz Scaggs to Billy Joel, all live somewhere with that truck. And then when the truck, I had it rigged so we could pull out and just go do the work and then come back and plug the cables in. We were ready to go again in the Factory. And that's when I produced two Tom Fogerty albums, and on the first one I played a lot of guitar. And I was real proud of that one.
I just want to stop you right now, because this is the most stunning. I mean, I think... Is it fair to say that Bogus would have used that truck once in a while?
Yeah,
because I'm telling you, man, that there are two albums that, ironically enough, my buddy's coming over tonight. We're going to play some music, and I'm going to play these 2 albums to jam to. They're the best 2 recorded live albums I've ever heard in my life, and it definitely was your truck. It was Cal Tjader live from the Funky Quarters, and then there was Concerts by the Sea, Cal Tjader with that same band that you recorded in the studio. Bogus is the one I believe he recorded, but that's your truck, man. That the Funky Quarters one.
The DSR truck commonly became known as the Credence truck.
Dude, it is the greatest. So explain for the miking techniques for Billy, like for these for like Billy Joel, he would be playing at a venue, and you would go bring the van over to the side, and then just rig the mic. How would you mic the room?
Just like I did in the studio.
Wow!
I actually did 2 live Credence albums. The first one was the Oakland Coliseum Homecoming album, and that one was mishandled by Fantasy and put out as the Royal Albert Hall, but it was actually their homecoming concert in Oakland.
Wow.
And then the European one was the second one. And that was my least favorite because Credence was a trio at that time, and issues had been festering, if you will, and John didn't want anything to do with it. So Doug and Stu were at the helm on that. And then things just started deteriorating. And then I brought in a fellow named Don Harrison from Southern California to record. He was really good. And then Doug and Stu were going to be a rhythm section, which they were, and they were great. And then those sessions, I hired Bogus to do some horn things, and I did some arrangements myself with him. And then
Harrison had already made albums before you brought him up, right?
No, I don't know if he did or not.
I seem to remember him on the Westbound label. That's really
his little place down there.
Wow.
But I think I made the very first good one, the one with the lion on the front, with his version of 16 tons, and Doug and Stu and I developed issues because I didn't want Harrison to go out on tour with those 2 because I just didn't feel that Harrison had the experience yet to jump in that league. And so one thing led to another, and I left, and then I went to work for John Fogerty.
Well, let's but before we have to do set 2. I wanted to end this session by I'm curious as to I think it's really beautiful because one of the guys I interviewed was Steve Cropper, and he talked about Duck Dunn and joining the band with Al Jackson, and I'm curious if you could tell me a really good Duck Dunn story.
Well, I recorded Cropper and Duck a lot.
How did that happen? I mean, they were ensconced at Stax.
Well, we all met when Credence was doing shows with Booker T and the MGs as the opener, and the guy that did Kansas City had the big hit, Wilbert Harrison. He went out with all these instruments attached to his limbs and played a little set. Then Booker T and the group played, and then Credence did their show. So that's where that all started, and we all became friends at the time. Well, when the Don Harrison band caused our company to break up, I wanted to keep working with Harrison, and then I went back to L.A. after that Fogerty employment, and then I started recording Harrison down there, and I did a bunch of songs, maybe an album's worth with Duck and Cropper, and I got a lot of stuff in the can that no one's ever heard that's really good, but
What?
I just don't know,
Oh, my. Wait, hold on. This stuff never saw the light of day?
Well, no, they haven't. I've just got them, and I got a bunch of other stuff too that I did. You remember when the tribute album craze was going on?
Of course.
Well, I figured I'd better record some Credence tunes before somebody else did, so I recorded Carl Perkins I produced these things. Carl Perkins doing Down on the Corner and another Credence tune. I got Billy Swan, the guy that had a big hit with I Can Help. He did Lodi, and Billy Swan and I wrote some nice songs together. And then I went to Scotty Moore's home in Nashville and recorded Ronnie McDowell singing Bad Moon Rising with Scotty playing the great licks. And Scotty was my hero. I just couldn't, when I was a kid, I couldn't wait for Elvis to come out with a new record, and I'd try and learn it, And so such a pleasure to do all those. But I must tell you that those songs, the record executives, and I've never said this before, they shied away from them because Fogerty had a bit of they just, I'll say it, they didn't want to do much that involved him.
Right. No, I think that's well said. I mean, it's
and even if he just was only the writer of those tunes, they shied away. And so that left those performances sitting in the dust.
Russ, Gary, let's be in touch and let's do set 2, man. We just cooked for 81 minutes here. That was amazing.
I'm amazed.
And
I may have a spare Cal Tjader album for you.
Dude, I'm telling you now, man. I've seen that album a few times, and it always, I'm like, there's something magical, and now I have to have it now because of you, man. That's the freaking greatest thing, because it actually is really funky and weird. It's not like it's just not a traditional jazz album at all. It's unreal.
No, it's Cal being a popster, if you ask me.
If do you have an email that I can send you a copy of this interview?
You mean my email?
Do you check email? I mean, I want to be able to get you the copy of our interview. And
oh, I'd love that.
All right, so give me your email.
It's Russ Mixer, Mixer.
Hold on one second. Russ Mixer?
Russ Mixer at AOL.com.
Russ Mixer at AOL. Yeah, man, I will. I'll email you my address if you want to. I mean, I'll take anything you got. Any extra copies of any of the I mean, we have a lot more to get to, but man, I will also.
Do you play vinyl?
Oh my! That's all I play.
Okay, good. That's what I'll send you.
All right. Well, let's
talking.
Let's stay in touch and do something before the end of the new year. We'll do another set.
Sounds good to me.
Much love, man. Thank you for taking the time, and I'll get you a copy. I'll send you something. I'll send you a link that you can stream this interview later.
Thank you very much.
Have a good one, brother. Talk to you soon.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, man. Bye. Thank you to Larry Murphy for connecting me with a Titanic engineer and producer, Russ Gary. It's been a heavy week on the Jake Feinberg Show, and we'll be back next week with a whole another slew of guests. Until then, on Power Talk, we'll see you.